continue our work in geography today by flipping in our books to page G32 and G33. And on these pages, they're specifically talking about a type of map, a thematic map. So we've looked at some maps already this year, some where we were just looking at learning country names or ocean names. Other maps try and teach us or tell us about specific things. So if we look at the bottom of this map, it's found on page 33, it says Atlantic resource locations for fish, petroleum, and nickel. So that kind of tells us what's happening on that map. The other thing that's very helpful to look at in a map when we're trying to figure out what it's about is to look at the legend. So in this map, it's up in the top right-hand corner. So we see a lot of information here in this legend. We've got our elevation and our sea depth. So a lot of maps show how high the land is, or in the ocean, how low the ocean is. This is one of those maps where, depending on the color of the land, we can see how high it is. So the highest land would be a gray color. Like, think about mountains. Don't see any that high there. And then the lowest land would be this green here, which is the sea level. So you're going to see a lot of that around the coast. And then it goes up. So you can see that Labrador here, we've got a lot of kind of this rocky interior where it's higher up. It has more elevation. It's more elevated than New Brunswick and Nova Scotia PEI, which are flatter and don't have that same elevation. The other thing we can notice here is the sea depth. So this lightest blue is up to 200 meters deep. So you can see that's all, of course, all along the edge. It makes sense that the ocean will be shallowest, closest to the land. And then we've got the next color out here, which is from 200 to 4,000 meters deep. That's 4 kilometers straight down. And then even deeper is this darker blue, where it is between 4 and 6,000 meters deep. So 4 to 6 kilometers deep out here. Some interesting things to note. On page 32, it talks a little bit about the Titanic, which is an interesting part of Canadian history, that the Titanic crashed and sank within Canadian waters. So there's some things in there where you're going to need to look carefully at the map. It does look at latitude and longitude, which remember we learned about earlier in the year. So we've got our lines of longitude. I had to think through that one a second. And our lines of latitude going this way. Right? So if I were to say take this dot here, that would be at 50 degrees west is our longitude, and 50 north is our latitude. Now, when we learned last week about the cod fishing issues in Newfoundland, we can see here, that's another thing that's marked on here, is the former cod habitat are these kind of purpley colors. That's where the cod used to live, and they were really plentiful in those areas. So remember, you read that in your book last week, some of the reasons why they had to stop cod fishing in 1992. When the settlers first came, they discovered a lot of cod. They started fishing. At the beginning, it was just mostly people fishing, taking a boat out, fishing for the day, coming home. And then in the 1950s, they developed these larger boats that would drag nets along the bottom. And they were huge boats that had like a factory right in there in the boat, so they could process and can the fish. They could stay out for months at a time. So that really made the number of fish being caught increase a lot. And then also European and other countries started coming and fishing for the cod as well. And up until the 1980s, they were allowed to fish within 5 kilometers of Canada's coast. So all along here would be areas where other people could come and fish. And then they changed that rule, and I've just got to remember the date. 1982, they changed that rule to be 370 kilometers off of the coast. So you can see that's what this line is here, the 370 kilometer limit. So after 1982, then foreign countries were not supposed to come in that range to fish for cod. However, it does say that even after that time, it wasn't always monitored, and there still were foreign countries coming and taking more cod than they were supposed to. So all those reasons led to the depletion of the cod supply. And it seems kind of strange to us now to think that they didn't realize it until it was too late, until there was only 1% of the cod. But this was, 30, 40 years ago. Their scientific modeling and their tools, and also the concern for the environment was less back then. So I think in hindsight, right, they realized that they should have placed limits on it much earlier so that they wouldn't get to the point that they got to in 1992. Just looking here again at the legend. The two things we hadn't mentioned yet is these little red dots. So those little red dots, it says one dot represents 200 people. So that shows us, first of all, one thing, if you look at Newfoundland and Labrador compared to New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PI, you see the dots are a lot more spread out. Newfoundland and Labrador have quite low populations. But what you can also notice is that the populations are largely around the coast. Right, which is probably because they were largely based on fishing. That was the main livelihood. Also, the interior of Newfoundland and Labrador, it's very rocky. It's it's tricky to farm, or there's not as much industry in those areas. So you can see how people are just really living around on the coast. And then the other thing here to mention, the black dot, oil and gas fields. So we read in our book about the oil fields that were discovered. So that is shown there. And then we also read in our book about the nickel that was found. And that's up here in Voisey's Bay. Okay, so a lot of the things that we read about were found on here. So your assignment today is going to be to read page 32 and 33. Look carefully at the map, and then in your Google Classroom, there will be an assignment to answer some questions about the map and these pages. All right, let me know if you have any questions.